Okay, Mr. Udell is back. Or maybe you didn't even notice I was missing. Nonetheless, here I am. Question number 4. What are the two basic mistakes any criminal justice system can make? That dealt with this slide right here. Country A and Country B. So in Country A, we know that the goal is let's catch all the guilty people. Let's make sure if you do something wrong, you get punished. But we're so strict sometimes we think two people were involved and we end up punishing the innocent. In Country B, we say, no, no, no. Let's make sure we protect all the innocent people. We never lock people up by mistake, but there's some guilty people running around. Obviously, neither of these are ideal and neither of them are perfect, but they do show the balance between A, the majority wants to make rules to keep itself safe, and B, that individuals do not want to be locked up by the majority just because they're accused of something that they did not do. So we talked about the different amendments that offer protections to people in that country. We know for one that we tend to be more like Country B because we say in this country that all are innocent till proven guilty. Turns out that's terrible colors. Let's fix that. And that is the language of Country B. We cannot accidentally lock people up because you are innocent until we prove you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And we read this whole story about Joe and using drug users, or people being accused of being a drug user. So we know the Fourth Amendment protected him from illegal search and seizure. We know that because of this famous court case, Mapp v. Ohio, that evidence eventually would be excluded from trial because of the exclusionary rule. We know that his Fifth Amendment was violated when he was told to answer questions because of the court case Miranda v. Arizona, which says you have to be read your Miranda rights, not Amanda, excuse me. We know that 6 months in jail, we said, might be a violation of the Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial. He cannot afford the $3 million bail, which would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment's excessive bail for a nonviolent drug offense. He studies the logbooks himself, would be another Sixth Amendment violation. So all throughout this, we said there are all sorts of things that we do in our system to make sure we don't lock people up by accident. You have to know who the witnesses are. You don't have to testify against yourself. The punishments can't be too extreme. We will provide free lawyers to people who can't afford them to make sure they are getting a fair trial. And the thing is that as it turns out, Joe really did use illegal drugs, but because we didn't go after him the right way, he will be set free. And that is evidence that we are a Country B organized society. However, there are times when we find ourselves in the gray area, and we might end up back as more like Country A. Like, for example, I don't think I told you this story, but there was a kid in Chicago carrying a plain brown paper bag. He walked around the corner and saw 4 police cars and turned and ran away. So they stopped him and wanted to look in his bag. And the question is, was he suspicious enough? Well, in Country A, they would say, sure, he was suspicious enough. And if he didn't do anything, we'll let him go. So what's the big deal? Whereas in Country B, people might say, well, you know what? In Los Angeles, they had to let about 200 people out of prison who were all framed. And almost all 200 of them were not white. And all the police officers were white. So actually, there is a good reason to run away, because you're going to be framed. So Country B would say, no, you can't stop and check people like that because there's all sorts of things that could go wrong. Our Supreme Court in that case said we're more like A. They said if you are running away and you have something like that, then that is suspicious and the police can look at you. So that's another balance between majority rules and minority rights. All right, question number 5. What does it mean to discriminate? So we know that when we're using discrimination in everyday language, we're talking about something we don't agree with, because we usually mean racial discrimination or hateful discrimination, or these are things we do not approve of. However, we say that all laws discriminate, because discrimination is when you classify or draw distinctions between people. So how are we going to treat people who murder different than people who don't? Well, we're going to discriminate against them. We're going to classify and treat them differently. But to keep in mind when we are allowed to discriminate and when we are not, we know that all laws must pass the rational basis test. That's the easiest and the lowest test. As soon as you treat somebody different than somebody else, you have to have a reasonable government objective. You can't just do things randomly or arbitrarily. So if you said all people under 5'3" have to pay extra taxes, they would say there's no reason for that. It doesn't make sense. You wouldn't be able to do it. However, if we say people driving over 70 will pay a bigger speeding ticket than people driving 60, then there would be a reason for this, which is we're treating you differently because you're creating more of a danger. So we will jump down from here from number 1 to number 2, intermediate scrutiny, which would say if you were treating people by disability or sex differently than other people, then you have to do more than just have a reason. You have to have a good reason, right? So you could not have a totally separate bathroom with people with disabilities, although you can have stalls that are accessible for people with disabilities. But you could not have a separate bathroom for just people who were taller, or a separate bathroom for people who are wearing blue shirts. Like there would be no sense to this. But it is considered a reasonable government objective, an important one, to have different bathrooms or locker rooms for people with different sexes. Last but not least, there was the strict scrutiny test, and this is the really hard one. You have to prove an amazing, compelling governmental interest if you want to treat somebody differently by race, religion, or ethnicity. Most of the time, that's considered suspect, meaning that if you treat one race differently than another, we're going to assume that you made a mistake. So if you are being treated differently by race, like we saw with the kids trying to get into the school in the video in Little Rock, if they are being discriminated against, this is related to civil rights because we would expect the government to come and help those kids get into school. So notice this goes back to our very first slide at the very beginning. The two types of freedom are the negative liberty, which we've mostly talked about. Government stay out of my religion. Government stay out of my democratic freedoms. Government don't harass me and arrest me when you shouldn't. But in these cases, for those kids who were trying to get into school, we needed the government to take a positive action to help those kids get into school and stop private discrimination against them. All right, last but not least, you will see on your review sheet here, fourth period, that there is a sixth question, and because of the unusual way things have worked out, you are not responsible for number 6, so you can just ignore it. So therefore, it is also true that you can ignore days 11 and 12 on here. You do not have to know those terms. I will not test you on them. All the other terms you do have to know. And I think I have covered all of the terms on here in that discussion, but I will just make sure. So I did not go over some of these terms, the black codes and the 14th Amendments, but I assume we remember those from our discussion of the history of civil rights. I'm having trouble finding. There it is. The black codes were the laws passed right in the wake of the Civil War to basically re-enslave former people who were enslaved by making it against the law not to have a job, which none of the former enslaved people did, so then they would lock them up. And then we know the 14th Amendment was very important because it was guaranteeing equal protection of the laws and rights, which was violated by Jim Crow and eventually overturned in 1954. Okay, so those are questions 1 through 5 for your review sheet. The test will be on Friday. Again, I will not be here. If you're a person who uses the testing room, I will leave instructions for the sub to write you a pass, and I will leave copies of the test down there.